Good afternoon. I'm Violet Zariello, Marketing Manager and American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here. Past Forward, Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores the role of politics and nationalism at the Olympic Games. It is inspired by two of our streaming docs, Jesse Owens and The Boys of 36. In today's conversation, our guests will examine the political motives behind competing at and hosting the Olympics. They will discuss whether the games themselves are meant to foster peace or act as a soft power battleground for superpowers. They will examine the role of the United States in creating both of these perceptions and dig into how the ambitions of individual athletes fit within a nation-state's view of the games as a means toward national glory throughout history and today. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat, and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Better Angel Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it's my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Dave Zirin writes about the politics of sports for The Nation magazine. He is the winner of Sport and Society and Northeastern University School of Journalism's Excellence in Sports Journalism Award. Zirin is also the host of Sirius XM Radio's popular weekly show, Edge of Sports Radio, and is a columnist for Slam Magazine and The Progressive. Kendra Gage is a postdoctoral scholar in the Interdisciplinary Studies program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her research and teaching focus on 20th century America, the American West, Black feminist thought, and the civil rights movement. She is currently reworking her manuscript for publication, Creating the Black California Dream, Verna Canson and the Black Freedom Struggle in the Golden State's Capital, 1940 to 1988. The conversation will be moderated by Adrienne Lentz-Smith. Dr. Lentz-Smith is an associate professor of history at Duke University. She is a scholar of African American history, as well as the histories of the 20th century United States and the US and the world. She is the author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Violet, and welcome, Kendra and Dave. I want to take a second to congratulate you, Kendra, on your recent sort of position, joining of the faculty at UC Riverside, where you are the assistant professor of teaching and history, where you're actually teaching about the history of the Olympics. And yeah, so congrats, that's great.
Thank you.
We are, it's timely, right? Because we're here today to talk about politics and nationalism at the Olympic Games, just as the Paris 2024 Summer Games are getting started. And as Violet mentioned, this discussion is inspired in part by American Experience's streaming films, Jesse Owens and The Boys of 36. Both of these films take place during the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but we hope to talk today about multiple Olympic moments where nationalism and geopolitical conflicts have taken center stage. So I'm going to get us started with a question first for Kendra and then one for both of y'all. Kendra, when were the first Olympics and why were they created? And do you think that the ideals that spurred the initial Olympics, modern Olympics, are relevant today?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And thank you for the congratulations as well. The first modern Olympics were created by Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who was a French aristocrat who as a young man had witnessed the defeat of his country by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. And he really viewed both modernization and industrialization as crippling to masculinity. And so he really grew concerned about the lack of what he saw, a sporting ethic and kind of an absence of physical education programs in the school. And he actually travels to England and the US to observe these programs. He comes back really excited and wants to introduce these types of programs to French educators who are very reluctant to do so. So he comes up with this grand plan to reintroduce the modern Olympics, and he finds a lot of support from other nations as well, and forms the International Olympic Committee. And in homage to the ancient Olympics, they decide to have the first modern Olympic Games in 1896 in Athens. And a part of those initial ideals, too, was that there would be this separation of nations and politics, and that these games would be fair games of play, that amateurs would take the center stage, and that these games would be a place where athletes could come together and kind of mutual understandings, friendships, and fair play. And I think a lot of those ideals are still at play if we look at the athletes themselves and how they approach the games. But if we look at how nations approach the games, we've seen that these games have become a hotbed for political activity. So I think those distinctions are really, really important as we approach this conversation.
It's interesting, an interesting distinction between the athletes and the nations from which those athletes hail. A question for both of y'all. Hosting the Olympic Games requires an enormous amount of resources, both time, money, and physical space. But every 4 years, the games go on, and countries vie to be the hosts. What motivates countries to host the Olympics, given the resources required to do so? And I think I'll start with Dave and then kick it over to you, Kendra.
Sure. I did a book with 1968 Olympian John Carlos, who famously raised his fist on the medal stand. And John Carlos always used to say to me that the reason why they have the Olympics every 4 years is that it takes them 4 years to count the money. And I think that's an important thing to think about, because the Olympics for regular citizens can often be a spectacle of debt, displacement, and hyper-militarization of public space. I'm in Paris right now. I'm seeing it on every street corner, what I just described to you. But there's also a ton of money that goes into the Olympic Games and benefits a sliver of the population, from corporate sponsors to government officials who don't mind being bribed. There's a lot of money to be had. The real estate industry, the security industry looks at the Olympics as their Super Bowl, for goodness sakes. There's AI technology being used in Paris, for example. So I think nations vie for these Olympics for the same reason why a lot of modern nations love what they call trickle-down economics, which are really trickle-up economics. They benefit a sliver of very powerful people, so they vie for those Olympics. They vie for those tourist dollars as well. They vie for those service industry dollars. But for a lot of citizens, hosting the Olympics can be quite the trial.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And just to add to that too, I think that some nations see the Olympics as an opportunity to rebrand themselves too. This is kind of the biggest commercial of their lives. We've seen, Germany did this with the 36th Olympics. China does this in 2008 and 2022. Russia does this in 2014, where they're able to propel an image of themselves to the rest of the world that says, hey, the rest of the world is saying this about us, but look who we are. We're innovators. We're at the forefront of technology. Look at how well our athletes are doing. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for countries to make a new image of themselves as well.
So what I hear both of y'all saying in different ways is that investment of those resources pay dividends, right? Be they material or ideological. And there have been observers of the Olympics who've noted that there seem to be kind of two approaches to for countries that they take when they compete at these games. These Olympics are either seen as an opportunity to create peace and understanding through sports, or as we've talked about, a sort of soft power battleground for superpowers or want to be powers to assert agendas. So, Dave, what role has the U.S. played in creating and sustaining both of these perceptions, and how have Americans specifically, or the U.S. specifically, pursued geopolitical goals by participating in or boycotting the Olympics historically?
That's a fascinating question. And I think you're right to center it on the United States. I mean, certainly you could center it really on any country in the world that competes in the Olympics and say, how has nationalism and the Olympics affected that country's perspective on the games? Because nationalism runs through the Olympics in every country. That's why every country has their own Olympic committee to organize their athletes. But if we look at the 20th century as the American century, as a century where the United States stood astride the globe, then all these Olympics have huge ramifications. Thinking most clearly, of course, about the Cold War and the United States' constant military and economic competition with the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, and how every Olympics became this kind of ideological battleground, like which economic system, which social system is superior. It depends on who wins the 800 meters. It can be so silly when you take a step back from it, but it actually had real political ramifications in throughout the world, frankly. But there's one other part to your question I want to hit upon, because the United States can contain many nationalisms inside its borders. So you have a situation like at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, where there was U.S. nationalism, of course, the Cold War, wanting to dominate Mexico City, but you also had a collection of Black athletes who were projecting a very different kind of nationalism. A nationalism that, as they said, why should we run in Mexico City only to crawl home? So they saw the Olympics as a place to express Black pride, Black power, and Black unity, and which is its own kind, a very different kind of nationalism. But in the United States, we see how these different nationalisms can develop, and because it is the United States, it reflects throughout the world. I mean, I can tell you, in Paris, there are so many posters up of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, a man from Georgia and a man from Harlem, New York, raising their fists. I mean, so when the U.S. does something, when U.S. athletes do something, it can have these international reverberations, whether it's to stand with the red, white, and blue, or whether it's to resist the United States agenda.
That's really fascinating, because so I hear a couple of things in what you're saying. One, that, so as you say, there's sort of multiple nationalisms on display, which I imagine is intention, or maybe not. Maybe it just sits alongside the Olympics also as a demonstration of a kind of melting pot story, right? A nation of immigrants who represent the United States, but have connections to other countries they're competing against. But then also the 68 example is also a reminder that the Olympics provides a stage for people to present other competing understandings of the very nation which they are representing in an official capacity, which is a long-winded way of winding up for the next question. As we mentioned, the Summer Olympics are just about to commence in Paris. And Dave, you're on the ground and covered earlier today protests around those Olympics. Are you seeing parallels, and maybe you'll come back to the example you just gave us, or maybe there are others, to previous games and protests? And then, as a sort of bigger scale question, how do attendees, citizens, and residents of the host country see the games as a stage to amplify their causes? And does their using the Olympics as that stage, this is many questions at once, so if you want me to break it down, I can come back in. Does their using the Olympics as that stage often contrast with the goals of the country's leadership?
Wow. I mean, to look directly at Paris right now, to answer that question, these games in Paris are about as politically volcanic as any games in memory. precisely because the political situation in Paris, independent of the Olympics, is extremely polarized right now. They just had elections. They were very intense. It was the right-wing party and the left-wing party vying for power while the centrist party receded into the background. So a very tense political situation playing out across the country. And in Paris in particular, you have these issues that come along with the Olympics around debt displacement and hypermilitarization. And you have people protesting those issues as individual issues, particularly the issue of unhoused people, where over 12,000 families have been moved out of Paris for the purpose of making the city look, quote unquote, presentable. They call it social cleansing here. For an international audience and for the TV cameras. So that has spurred a lot of protest here in Paris. And I think it's something that you see at other Olympic Games. I mean, I've been covering the Olympics since 2004 in Athens, not 1896, but 2004. Don't let the gray hair fool you. But at all these Olympics, you do see dissent and protest. I mean, even in Beijing in 2008, people protested and they received hell for it, but they did protest. So there has been Olympic resistance in all these places, precisely because sometimes it really is at odds, like how a leadership of a country wants to rebrand, present itself to the world, really express itself as a global superpower, and then how people on the ground feel. Now in Paris, a lot of people have left town. People who can afford to have left. And a lot of people who are staying aren't feeling great about hosting right now. And one of the reasons is also, I mean, so many streets have been cut off, barricades have been put up. The securitization of the Olympics is a really intense spectacle. But because the Olympics are in a place like Paris, which does have this rich tradition of protest, I mean, people see it as almost their national duty to say right. Something. Like, for example, the dancers at the opening ceremony have approved a strike to maybe not perform because they want higher wages. The hotel workers where the IOC is staying staged a demonstration. I mean, all of these things are both very French, but also very of a piece with previous Olympic Games.
Right. And if the Olympics are, in some ways, there's a sort of, the leadership has a scripted idea of how they're going to go. The people who participate and the people who live around as they're happening are often going off script. Let's turn to another moment of spectacle, right, and intention, which was the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime sought to use the games to advance their image and ideology through propaganda and competition. Let's watch a clip now from The Boys of 36, where Hitler's focus on the Olympics as a soft power arena is on full display. And we'll turn to it now.
The opening ceremony was held on August 1st at the newly built sports stadium. The host's objective was not simply to welcome the world to Berlin, but to put on a show of national unity and pride unlike any the world had ever seen. To Adolf Hitler, the Games were the ultimate propaganda tool.
He was a very effective propagandist. And he was going to use the Olympics as his great show. He was going to bring out onto the world this new healed Germany, this reunified Germany, a stronger Germany, but also he insisted a peaceful Germany. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he was planning for war.
Hitler expected the German teams would dominate the games. The rowing team that the host nation brought to the narrow lake Langer See was no exception.
The German team was extremely dominant. Their government made it a national priority that their sports teams should succeed. They had clubs all over the country that were well coached, well funded.
They're given uninterrupted training. If they have jobs, they quit the jobs, and they're sponsored by the government.
The University of Washington, the Americans, come in as poor athletes from an unknown part of the world. Their ethic is because these guys worked on farms and crappy jobs. There's sort of a purity versus this artifice.
And the boys went out and just sort of explored the streets. And they quickly discovered that whenever Germans walk up to them, they would extend their hands, give the Nazi salute, and say, Heil Hitler. So the boys didn't quite know what to do about that. So they took to walking up to Germans, extending their hands and saying, Heil Roosevelt.
Okay, y'all. So what was really going on in Germany during the 1936 Olympics? And how do you think the working class American crew team's victory might have affected the Nazis' agenda for the games?
I think, in many ways, as the clip was talking about, that we know now that Hitler was engaged in this campaign of extreme nationalism, militarism, racism, and anti-Semitism, and that the Olympics were really an extension of that campaign to both strengthen and promote the Third Reich and this overall notion of this Germanic Aryan race. And, a lot of us historians call these games, they're the games of massive deception. Germany's trying to say that it's peaceful, that they're promoting culture, innovative achievements and athletic achievements, and it's re-emerging from a ban of the Olympics from the 1920s and 1924s. And so they really do need to project this particular image, but their overall agenda is the soft power notion of projecting athletic superiority. And then you have this team that comes in from the US that's all comprised of working class people who are not training each and every day, day in and day out, like the German rowers are. I mean, they've literally spent millions of dollars on the rowers to make sure that they are at that top level. They expect them to sweep every single category, and the US really strips that away from them. And I think it's also important to note that this is kind of the first truly global media event as well. We have 300 million people who are listening on their radios and listening to these broadcasts live. And so they're listening intently, and to hear live all over the world that their team has been taken down by this ragtag American team was really quite the blow to the Nazi regime and what they were trying to portray through the Olympics.
Yeah, you asked what's going on behind the scenes and how did the crew team affect Hitler's pride or German pride at this particular time, Nazi pride, what have you. The first thing behind the scenes, we have to talk about the running of the torch. The running of the torch is such a part of the Olympic tradition. It's happening right now here in Paris. It's a big deal, like who from which country gets to hold the torch and run with it, considered a great honor. I believe Snoop Dogg is running with the torch here in Paris. That should be a sight to see. Hopefully the torch will just be used as a torch. But the thing about it that I find so interesting is that the torch running doesn't start with Pierre de Coubertin. It doesn't start in 1896. It's one of Joseph Goebbels' henchmen, Karl Diem, who came up with this idea of running of the torch, connecting it to Greek antiquity. And the whole idea of it is we'll run the torch through this section of Europe as this way of sort of promoting peace and highlighting the games. But when you look back at it, they were running the torch through areas that Germany sought to conquer. And so Nazi propaganda was brought with the torch. I mean, it's this horrible artifact of fascist expansionism, and it's fascinating to me that it still is such a critical part of Olympic pageantry. Now, what about those boys in the boat, and what did they mean? What I find interesting is I wonder what de Coubertin, who was still alive, did not attend the 36 Olympics, but was very much fine with them taking place in Germany. I would wonder what he was thinking as well, because his conception of the Olympics were so much about it being an elite operation, you know, the province of the amateur. He said he did not want laborers or artisans. There's a word that's sort of lost its pull, an artisan, but no artisans in the Olympics, because they were deemed professionals, and there could not be professionals in the Olympic Games, which meant no working class people in the games. It basically shut them out. So to see this team of working class people achieve gold, I have to think that it made de Coubertin's monocle drop from his eye.
It's a very serious answer that was colored, at least for me, by a vision of Snoop running with the torch and like doot, 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 playing alongside him as he went. Dave, can you share other examples of Olympic Games where political tensions and nationalism interacted with and affected the competition, particularly with where the U.S. was involved?
Well, it's interesting because it's like, when haven't they, is more my question. I mean, we spoke before about the Cold War and about how every 4 years it becomes this contest over which country's social system is superior, and everybody takes their side and pushes through. And then, of course, in the later stages of the Cold War, you have 1980, where the U.S. refuses to go to Moscow and boycotts those Olympic Games after the invasion of Afghanistan. And then in 1984, the USSR and the Eastern Bloc follows suit and doesn't go to Los Angeles for a games that the United States absolutely dominated without their number one foe in attendance. But if there's a story I want to say, it's just that it shows how deep nationalism is inbred into the Olympic Games, both nationalism of big nations and nationalism of individuals. Like, when I hear your question, I think of 1906 and an Olympic runner named Peter O'Connor, who is Irish, but he had to run with the Great Britain team because Ireland wasn't recognized as its own nation. And he was so angry about this that after winning gold, he and the flags of the Union Jack started to rise up on the flagpole. Peter O'Connor climbed up the flagpole, tore down the Union Jack, and held up his own flag that said "Ireland Forever." This is 1906. The Olympics start in 1896. So there's a whole reason why they had it in 1906, and then they had another in 1908. That's not so important for our conversation, but it is just to point out that this nationalism, this idea of resistance, I mean, amidst that nationalism, is something that is so deeply baked into the cake of the Olympic experience.
So this leads me to a question for Kendra, right? Which is, what happens? I mean, in some cases, the answer to that question is they defy it. But what else happens when individual athletes are asked to carry the burden of national representation? And how are these effects compounded by the gender, class, race, or characteristics of the athlete?
I mean, I think this pressure is very immense for athletes, especially when we take these other factors into consideration. And when I think of this question, Wilma Rudolph immediately comes to mind. I mean, Wilma Rudolph comes to the forefront for track and field at a time where the Soviets are really challenging us at the Olympics, and we finally acquiesce and we send a team to the Olympics, and she really benefits from this time. But she's not only in this time period of the Soviets, but she's also battling notions of what Black femininity is, what it means to be a woman in track and field, and countering a lot of these notions of to be a track athlete as a woman as not to be muscular, but to be feminine as well. And that's something that the US team itself really latches onto, that idea, is that our women are going to be women first and then track athletes second. And she is very productive at the 1960 Olympics. She wins 3 Olympic medals at that particular Olympics. And the US then really uses her story about how she battles adversity. She conquers pneumonia, polio, scarlet fever, and poverty, but they really never mention the racism that's rampant in the US at that time as well. And they used her in many ways that they used Jesse Owens. She goes on tour with the AAU, and they use her to sell tickets and to raise funds. And then they make a film of her that's like this 10-minute short that highlights not only her athleticism, but her duty to her country and how she's a Christian woman as well. And then she's sent as a Goodwill ambassador to Africa to not only perform and showcase her talents, but to talk about how wonderful racial environments are in the US. Well, when she returns to the US, to her hometown of Clarksville, Tennessee, she actually participates in a sit-in in a little restaurant called Shoney's in an effort to desegregate that particular restaurant. So she's doing all of these things at the national level, international level, that say, hey, America's great. I'm here in this wonderful environment. But when she returns home, she's really not afforded that same type of treatment whatsoever. And I think really in modern times too, we've seen those continued pressures. The Tokyo Olympics, Simone Biles, she steps out from those particular Olympics because of the burden that she feels in shouldering that responsibility to bring the gold home. And then we find out later, she says, I'm stepping out for mental health reasons. But just a few short months later, she testifies in the Nassar case and talks about the abuses that she receives from the very same people who are supposed to be protecting her. And I think this is an important pivot too for a lot of athletes. I've talked to other scholars about this, that we saw this kind of as a new wave of Black activism as well, is that she was able to come forward and be very critical of her nation in a way that people didn't think she was being unpatriotic. And I think that was something that Wilma Rudolph would not have been afforded if she had stood up at that time and said, hey, the conditions in the United States aren't great. I'm not able to go sit in this restaurant. There's cases of extreme racism here. And I think that we've seen a change in that. But those are two examples that come to my mind of two athletes who really have endured incredible burdens put on from that national pressure of being able to perform at that level while all of these other factors are going on at the same time.
May I add a quick...
Remind us, what was the year? Oh, go ahead. I was just going to ask quickly the year that Wilma Rudolph was desegregating the Shoney's.
That was in the 60s, 61.
Yeah. So you wanted to add something really quickly?
Yeah, real quick. I just wanted to add that the two flag bearers for the United States at these Olympics, there's always a male and a female flag bearer. They're LeBron James and Coco Gauff. Now, what makes them so special to me is that they're both people who have spoken out against racism, have spoken out on political causes. And remember, the people who hold the flags, people might not know this, that's voted on by your fellow Olympians to see who gets to hold the flag. So the fact, like from the athletic perspective, from all these different people, from all these different backgrounds who represent the United States, that they say, hey, LeBron James, hey, Coco Gauff, you are going to represent us, to me, it is kind of beautiful in its way, in terms of how we look at patriotism.
And such a contrast from the next clip that we're going to see, which at the 1936 Olympics, runner Jesse Owens dominated the track and field events at the games and won gold. But Hitler, breaking with tradition, refused to shake his hand. We're going to watch a clip now from Jesse Owens, from the film Jesse Owens, where we see how the Nazi snub was received back home.
Very glad to have won the 100 meters in the Olympic Games here in Berlin. A very beautiful place and a very beautiful setting. The competition was grand, and we're very glad to come out on top. Thank you very kindly.
Tradition called for the leader of the host country to congratulate the gold medal winner. But Hitler refused to greet Owens. "Do you really think," the German leader said, "I will allow myself to be photographed shaking hands with a Negro?"
The snub of Jesse Owens by Adolf Hitler gave the press a hook to really excoriate Adolf Hitler and to push Jesse Owens to the fore as a man who essentially stuck a thumb in the eye of the Nazi leader and his theories of Aryan superiority.
As an African American, all of us shared the snubbery by Hitler of Jesse Owens. Jesse was ours, he was us, he was me. And when Hitler snubbed him, he snubbed every one of us.
When I think about Jesse Owens at the Olympics, I think about the passage in Glenda Gilmore's Defying Dixie, where she talks about how the Atlanta Constitution refused to talk about him, right? For the longest time in the lead up to the Olympics, they overcovered, I can't remember, some guy named Ben, as if Jesse Owens weren't actually competing. And that's in part because his talent and then ultimately his victory was a threat to the Aryan racial ideologies pushed by the Nazis and shared by some Southern segregationists. In a similar way, how can national ideologies be challenged or reinforced when a team or athlete wins or loses at the Olympics? And what are some examples for this? This is a question for Dave, but Kendra, you might want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating when you go back and look at the 1936 Olympics and how they were received both in the United States and Germany, particularly Jesse Owens' dominance. In Germany, there was a lot of saying to the United States, mocking the United States, saying, oh, you need Black people to win gold medals. So, haha. So like this kind of, you can't even do it with your real Americans. You have to do it with your former enslaved people was basically what they were saying. And in the United States, a lot of the columnists who were enraptured with Owens in the white press were talking about what we would call today post-racialism, saying like, how can it, and this is when Jim Crow is alive and well throughout the South, they're saying, how can anybody call the United States racist? How dare the Germans call us racist? How dare people in the Soviet Union call us racist? Like when we can produce someone like a Jesse Owens. And yet with Jesse Owens, you also see the limitations of athletic success and the limitations of the success of representation. Because of course, as the documentary shows so sadly, Jesse Owens comes home to the United States where he's snubbed by Franklin Roosevelt. So Jesse Owens actually campaigned for Wendell Willkie in the 1940 presidential election against Roosevelt. And he would say in speeches, people talk about me being snubbed by Adolf Hitler. I was snubbed by FDR. And that was one of his big speech lines. And so even though Jesse Owens is so famous and he's incredibly bright and able to just totally talk circles around people, he's kept on the outside of the U.S. Olympic Committee, the U.S. Olympic movement, as it's called. And, he's not even invited to attend another games until 1968, when he was invited by Avery Brundage so he could go talk to people like Tommy Smith and John Carlos and tell them not to protest on the medal stand. That was how the Olympic movement treated Jesse Owens. And it shows the way that, they may have liked that Jesse Owens was able to win those medals, but, they wanted his body, not his mind.
So the meaning of it sounds like is contested even within the nation, never mind beyond the nation. But Kendra, when the U.S. is victorious at the games, even sort of given this contestation about meaning, or in spite of it, how do victories reinforce, or do victories reinforce narratives about American exceptionalism?
I love this question because I think even when we're not victorious at the games, that we still celebrate those victories, however small that they might be. From the very first Olympics, we send a very small contingency, and the papers right away pick up on this idea of American superiority and exceptionalism. We don't have terms of soft power at the time. We call them our athletic missionaries that are doing the work for the country throughout the world, right? And they're in very few events, but the presses are going to over-exaggerate those particular victories. And I think this is really important in times of turmoil as well, where we're having to prove ourselves on the world stage itself. I always think of the 1976 Lake Placid Games and the famous Miracle on Ice game, where we have another situation where you have college amateurs facing these superior professional Russian athletes, and they triumphantly beat them. And Al Michaels famously says, "We're witnessing, here's this miracle on ice that happens." But the victory really is represented more than an upset of the ice, but it's really this ideological victory of the Cold War that's talked about in the same light in that year as the Berlin airlift and the Apollo moon landing as well. And I'll always think of the 1984 Olympics too, is that we're very congratulatory of ourselves and all of our wins during that political environment and those games. But the Soviet Union and all of those other bloc countries aren't even there. There's no contest about who is supposed to be the winners here. And I think that those are the moments that we can point to and say, hey, we're at the forefront here, but we are unopposed to a large degree. And I think the last one I'll point to is the 2008 Beijing Olympics as well. We're coming off of a decade of tragedy with 9/11, and we're in the midst of the Great Recession. And we really latch on to those gold medals. Michael Phelps brings 8 home. We're enthralled with the basketball team and what we call the Redeem team. And they go to the Olympics and they really bring U.S. basketball back home to where it belongs after losing in the previous Olympics. These are all moments where American exceptionalism is on display, but I argue that we choose if we look at all of the Olympics, we're going to find moments that American exceptionalism is used by the media and presses to highlight our American superiority.
I'm going to turn to the Q&A, which is going to keep pushing on the question of moments. The first question is, do y'all have a personal favorite Olympics that you love to talk about? About which you like to talk about the political significance? And if so, which one is it and why?
Well, I can jump in. I mean, some of this is because I did do that book with Dr. John Carlos, but I find the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City endlessly fascinating, from the fact that it was in Mexico City at all, to the fact that it was in October and not over the summer, to the fact that there was a horrific massacre in Mexico called the Massacre at Tlatelolco Square right before the Olympic Games, of largely protesting students and workers about the pressure that Black athletes were under to actually showcase their politics and their resistance at those Olympic Games, about the tensions among Black athletes as far as what to do and what not to do. And then, of course, the games themselves, it was record setting all over the place, from Tommy Smith in the 200, Lee Evans in the 400, Bob Beamon going 29 feet, 2.5 inches, a record that stood for 20 years. And it's still the second highest long jump in history. So I just find 1968 fascinating in that regard, because of not just the incredible play on the field, but just the incredible drama taking place in the locker room and off the field.
Yeah, for me, it would be the 1984 Olympics, just because there is so much politics behind that, despite, half of the play of field is not even there. And we're really promoting this new patriotism that's evident throughout the opening and closing ceremonies themselves. And I always call the 1984 Olympics this blend between the American dream meets the California dream, and painted by a picture of Norman Rockwell's apple pie patriotism, that you see all of that emerge in those particular Olympics. And perhaps one of my favorite moments, and many of us who were gymnasts as young people, look to Mary Lou Retton and her place in that particular Olympics. She defied everything that the Olympics image was. Here was this short, stocky girl who had a pixie haircut, who didn't look like any of the former gymnastics athletes that we had seen, who takes center stage, and she wins 5 medals, and she really becomes America's sweetheart from those games. And she embodies the idea of the American dream as well. Her family's mining background is really shown too, that the bootstrap is that bootstrap myth, is alive and well in the US, that if you just work hard enough, that you'll be able to achieve those particular dreams. And I remember reading one of her excerpts is that she didn't feel like she had done that much for Olympics, but everywhere she went, that people would approach her and say to her, thank you so much for what you did for America. And I think just because of her role in changing female Olympics here in our country, a trend that we have seen continue till today, that's really why she and that particular Olympics are one of my favorites.
I'll throw in as an Atlantan, the 96 Olympics in Atlanta. Because Atlanta was so determined to demonstrate and prove itself as an international city, that it's a reminder that it's not just nations, but the sort of hosting sites themselves that also want something from it. The following question asks about a sort of return to Los Angeles. The 2028 Olympics will again be hosted in Los Angeles. Many have said is because they were the only U.S. city willing to host them. What factors hold cities back from hosting? And why is Los Angeles, or I would add, why does Los Angeles believe itself better positioned to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it has to do with the fact that many cities have soured on hosting the Olympics and have withdrawn bids. That's not just a United States story; that's a global story. Because what the cities don't want is, and countries, but it often comes at a city level, is they don't want to carry the debt, they don't want the hyper-militarization, they don't want the traffic. I mean, sometimes it's as basic as that. And so when a city like Boston saw itself as a front runner for these LA Olympics, I mean, the people of Boston really stood up and said no. And one of the reasons they said no is that if you've ever been to Boston, it's difficult to drive around without the Olympics being there. And so the vision that a lot of people had about the disruption to their lives that the Olympics could bring, they wanted no part of it. Chicago wanted no part of it either. There was mass organizing in Chicago to keep the Olympics out, and that bid was withdrawn. Los Angeles is an interesting place because it's so big and sprawling that actually speaks to its advantage in terms of pushing forward as a host city. Also, it still has a lot of the facilities from 1984. So, and there is still a lot of nostalgia in Los Angeles about those 84 Olympics, even though there was a pretty nasty underbelly to those Olympics as well, which we could talk about another time. But it's just to say that Los Angeles was positioned with that feeling of we can get that 1984 glow back in 2028. And that proved to be, I think, a very powerful narcotic to people. But already you do have resistance in Los Angeles. I mean, it's been in the city council meetings. It has to do with how they are dealing with unhoused people in the city in preparation for the games. So I expect Los Angeles to be a place of a lot of conflict as the Olympics approach, which would be in sharp contrast to 1984.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think that nostalgia element is huge and why LA was so quick to make that bid. And I also believe that they harken back to this belief that they could make them profitable again, just like they did in 1984, even though the factors are very, very different. They're not going to have all of the television revenues that they did in 84 because they do have to share those with the IOC. But I think that they're going back and having this belief that they can make them very profitable and convincing people that we did it in 84, so why can't we do this again?
Yeah. So This question could lend itself to seedy underbellies or fun facts, depending on what direction you choose to go. But one of our viewers asks, what might the casual Olympics viewer be surprised to know goes on behind the scenes?
Ooh. Oftentimes, what goes on behind the scenes spills out into the open in a series of corruption trials and arrests. I mean, Brazil, coming out of Rio, saw numerous arrests of top political officials for taking bribes from particularly the real estate industry, which always sees the Olympics as just a huge cash cow. I mean, money and checks are handed out surreptitiously under the table. There are currently 4 open investigations going on in Paris, in France, right now about bribing officials for the Olympic Games. So the question, like, I always wonder is like, wow, if this is what we're hearing about, then what actually is going on behind the scenes? I have a feeling there's some things that would make Caligula blush.
I always say too that people don't realize, I think at this particular opening ceremony, there's going to be 100 diplomats that are going to be at that particular opening ceremony. And the question begs then is like, what are they doing there? What are those relationships that they're making there? They're not just there to watch the opening ceremonies. They're there for other reasons as well. So I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And as you have said, Dave, what we know about is probably 1/10 of what actually happens, and I pale to know what actually happens.
So the following question makes me think of, I think Mongolia, who are the ones who have the Superfly uniforms. But this question asks, do athlete uniforms reflect larger political goals or social movements?
Wow. You mean the uniforms that they're assigned to wear? Or flair that they put on the uniforms?
Well, that's a question. All questions can be interpreted. So answer.
Yeah, because I mean, they're strict about what can be worn, but then people can provide their own flavor to it. I mean, the women's 100-meter dash isn't only a place to showcase some of the finest athletes in the world, but it's also a place where people who are into fingernails know that they're going to see some things that are going to make your head spin. I mean, and then sometimes people take their outfits and put them in a political realm. Like particularly coming out of Australia, people who believe in Aboriginal rights have long worn things that may be against the Australian Olympic Committee's idea of what they should be wearing, but they will wear it anyway. And I think that's what I always find interesting is the transgression, because you've got the uniforms, and then what are the athletes doing to bring their own flavor to it?
And I think to add to that too is what we see them wear in the opening ceremonies and then what they wear to their actual events is very, very different. And the opening ceremonies, that's really an act of nationalism and patriotism that's showcasing what that particular country wants you to see as well. And the athletes have to wear that particular garb. And then they have the freedom within reason to put other things on. I always think about the Olympics where Levi Strauss is outfitting our Olympic athletes, and it's how it's showing this individual rugged person of the West. And that those are items that we want people to conflate with the US as well. So there's kind of 2 different questions too. Like, what are they wearing as they come in to the stadiums as well? And what does that represent? And then what are they wearing when they're actually at the event are 2 different things. Yeah.
Dave's response has me thinking about your earlier conversation about Wilma Rudolph and other Black women track athletes and the ways that Black women's bodies commented upon, judged, are politicized, and the ways in which current Black track stars seem to repurpose that gaze for an assertion of self and power that I think is a political expression. All right, our second to last question. Most of what you've described, asks one of our viewers, leans towards propaganda. Are there any examples of a nation using the world stage for good?
You want to go first on that one?
I mean, I would argue that sometimes they're both the same. Propaganda and using their positionality for good could be interpreted as somewhat the same agenda in many, many ways. I mean, I don't think that nations are insidious sometimes. The US is not coming forward and saying, okay, we're going to run this torch as the Germans did through these areas because we're going to take over these particular territories. And we're not purposely doing this because we want to make sure that everybody knows that we're better than China. So I think that this is kind of a difficult question and a double-edged sword, because there are propaganda elements, but I don't know if propaganda can't be for good sometimes as well. For example, I know that the Paris Olympics right now is that the games are open. And that phrase itself, that slogan, encapsulates so many things, that the games are open to a more diverse population. The games are open to more people that haven't been able to participate in the games. And that could be interpreted in some ways as propaganda, but on the other hand, that can be something that's really good and beneficial, not only for our athletes, but for the world itself.
See, that's a great point. The slogans are never, "We will crush you." I mean, they always try to the best angels of our nature. And then we have to deal with oftentimes the gap between what's putting out there and what's actually delivered. But because they are raising that bar rhetorically, it does give people the opportunity to say, well, you promised this, let's deliver.
That actually, in some ways, it is the contestation, the disagreement, the competing understandings visible on a broader stage that is doing the work of showing kind of like democratic wrangling in practice. For our final question, which may be sort of re-expression of that same last question, but slightly different, I think. Do the Olympics fuel nationalism, in your view, or do they promote cooperation between nations? And what might we look for during the Paris Olympics to get an answer to that question?
I'll start so Kendra can have the last word on this one. And also because Kendra and I might not agree on this one. I just think that the Olympics are a machine of nationalism. I don't think they can exist without the ideas of nationalism. I think they're so part of what the Olympics are and what they represent, national pride and all the rest of it. What I find, though, very interesting is you think about like Kathy Johnson, the Australian runner of Aboriginal descent who wins gold in Australia. Like things like that, to me, showcase a different kind of nationalism, and that can oftentimes really build a lot of pride and resistance in a country. When you ask the question about what we could possibly see at Paris, I mean, I got to tell you, like it's very, very volcanic here. Whether you're talking about Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, there are nationalisms and national arguments taking place and demonstrations taking place all over the place. So I think nationalism will take center stage at these games. The question will just be what the political flavor of it is.
Yeah, I don't know if we disagree all that much either, Dave. I mean, the IOC messaging for this particular games was that it was going to be this diverse setting and celebrating the unity of the world. But the fact of the matter is that politics and world turmoil don't end when the Olympics themselves start. And so, of course, nationalism is going to be front and center in these games because they've always been really inherent during the games. And I think that we still need to make that distinction between the athletes and governments. I do see athletes cooperating together during the game and kind of nations coming together in that way. But as far as you can't have an Olympics without nationalism, it's just become inherently a part of what the games are today.
Y'all, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. It's been thought-provoking. It's been illuminating, and it's been timely. So I appreciate your taking the time to have this conversation. And I'll pass it back to Violet for closing remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring politics and nationalism at the Olympics. You can watch Jesse Owens and the Boys of 36 on our website and the PBS app. You can watch our Past Forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great evening.